Hello, my name is Michaela Bauer, and I am presenting over my case study, When Ethics and Policies Collide. Okay, so let's evaluate. Let's talk about some of the things going on. So we are reading this from the perspective of the assistant principal, Mr. Richard Inman. He is the assistant principal at Rocket Junior High with 900 students, where Mr. Richard is waiting for the students at bus 50 on the south side of town. He has worked to create a relationship with those students to hopefully turn their lives around and make better decisions. One of the core students, his name is James, and he's considered to kind of be the ringleader. In our story, when it takes place, later in the day, a teacher sees an exchange of what they believe to be drugs between James and an honor student named David. David is an honor student. He's a standout trombonist who they say is quiet and nervous. Mr. Richard has had both boys escorted into the office by the school officer, and during this, they say he will regret later. The students are searched, and David is found to have a set of brass knuckles, and the officer arrests David and said it's against school policy. James immediately stands up for him and says that those are actually his. He made him take them. The principal tries to argue back with the officer, but he doesn't listen, and he takes the students to a detention facility. There we go. Mr. Richard calls both mothers to discuss the decision. James's mother says, good for him. Let him sit there and decide what he's done. David's mother is outraged, and she shows up to the school a few days, and she sits there and she wants to know what's going on. And so then she ends up going immediately down to the detention place to go pick up her son. Mr. Richard files paperwork on James, but not David. Later in the story, David is back at school, and James is in the DAEP custody. Mr. Richard is told by his director to fill out an expulsion paperwork, but he refuses. The director follows up with that there should be an office for reprimand or referral at the minimum, or it would end up on his personal file. So let's talk about some of the legal versus ethical things. Legally, being in possession of a weapon is against school policy. Lying to an administrator or police puts everyone in harm. Legally, the principal should have had both students detained for possessing a weapon. Ethically, the student, David, should have never taken the brass knuckles or reported it immediately, and the principal not filling out the paperwork on both students. So let's synthesize. 2 students were taken into custody for possessing an illegal weapon against school policy. One of the students was forced by the other student to take, against his will, to take the weapon. So let's look at some of the facts. The people involved: the principal, James, David, police officer, the moms, and then, they mention the teacher. It takes place at Rocket Junior High, and then the principal's office. And the programs we know are a public school, the principal's office referral paperwork, and then the DAEP center. So review and prioritize. So our stakeholders / damage is the principal, police officer, David, James, and the board. So, who is this going to affect? This is definitely going to affect the principal, James and David, and then, if some sort of policy forms, and obviously the board. Have all the relevant stakeholders been consulted? The only thing I noticed is the superintendent was not, the board obviously was not, and it said that he was an assistant principal, so I would assume there's a head principal, so the head principal needs to be informed. Can I learn more about this situation? Yes, the story obviously can't go massively in depth, but, there's nothing really about school bullying, and there's also nothing really in depth about what the weapon policy is. And then, we would review other incidents that have happened. And then, do you know enough information to make a decision? I believe I do. So let's talk about 3 potential options. So the no change would be the situation stays how it does, it plays out. So James is expelled or to the detention center, and David's back at school. The most drastic one is the paperwork is filed on both students. Both boys are sent to the detention center, and it's a strict policy. The moderate, the head principal / both administrators need to be aware. The paperwork should be filed just to track the cases, but both boys should have a different type of disciplinary action for what occurred. So let's talk about pros and cons. The no action pros would be it stays the same. Cons would be one student is in trouble, the other is not, and it feels very discriminatory. Number 2, drastic. So the pros would be both students are reprimanded for their actions, but the cons is there's no gray area and the policy is very strict. And then the third option is pro, is there's a policy change. Both boys are disciplined for their actions. There is paperwork to track the situation. The cons is this can get really tricky about policy change. So I chose option number 3, the moderate. So the reason why I chose this is I believe that this is the best situation because both boys are held accountable for the situation. One is reprimanded for having a weapon, and the other is reprimanded for not reporting it and being a bystander to what happened. The policy change, we would enact a policy change to help with the leniency of, that gray area of what's happening. My steps would be we meet with the head principal to discuss the situation. We would reflect on a similar case. We would start by meeting one-on-one with each student. We would let them know how they're going to be reprimanded for their actions. And then, we'd follow up by filing paperwork. And then lastly, which is going to take the longest, but we would work on a policy change or an addendum. So let's talk about it. The choose the path, that is the exact same thing as what I just mentioned. The meet with the principal, review a similar case, meet with the students, talk about discipline, fill out paperwork, and policy change. What happens? I believe that the students will understand the situation and consequence for their actions. And then I would start by drafting a new policy with the head principal and any others involved who want to help create this policy. Who needs to know? The head principal, the superintendent. I would say the teachers, if there is a committee formed for the new policy, and then finally after the policy is put in place, the Board of Education so they can make a vote to adopt the policy or not. So involvement, I believe the 2 principals will be involved, as well as maybe a guidance counselor, because, that can always be a tricky situation. And then, followed by the superintendent and the Board of Education. Warn, don't threat. So after the boys have been informed on the decision and they are fully aware of the situation, there will be paperwork to follow up to track the documentation. My plan B is if this doesn't go through, it's not approved, I would go back to the drawing board to brainstorm, a different type of disciplinary action, or if the board does not adopt the policy for gray area, we would go back and we would figure out why they didn't adopt it, what they didn't like, and maybe try and come up with a better resolution. So I wanted to add a little story in here super quick. So we actually had something like this happen my second year here when I was teaching. We had a senior boy who decided to bring alcohol to school, which is against school policy and also being a minor. There was a freshman girl, this boy was a senior, and there was a freshman girl who had a crush on him, and he forced her to take this alcohol and put it in her locker because he didn't want to get caught. Well, some of the teachers got suspicious about it and decided to, check in with my principal about it. So my principal went, did a locker search, found the alcohol, even went and checked the cameras to make sure that everything lined up. And needless to say, what happened was the boy denied the entire time that it was his, even though we had it on camera that it was his alcohol that he had forced the girl to take. But because the girl, it was kind of odd because she had a crush on him and she thought that if she stood up for him, she was doing the right thing, And so because she lied and she took the blame and she took the fall for it being hers, she did as well get a suspension. Not quite as long as his, but they both were suspended for this. I think this is a great area of where that gray area happens and where, we have a policy that says if you do this, you have to be out of school for X amount of days. But, our policy says it's this to this amount of days. It's not just exactly this. Does that make sense? So we were able to work within that gray area of how many days each person should be gone. So there we go. That's my story about how I found this case study to be very applicable to a real life situation. So let's talk about the final thoughts, the standard integration. So the standards were 2.2, 2.3. So this assignment has taught me how to ethically assess, handle, and demonstrate the knowledge of how to deal with tough ethical situations within the school environment. I have also gained the knowledge to understand how to communicate and model good ethical behavior. Relevancy. The assignment was relevant to my learning as it took a real world example and made me look at the options and possibilities of handling this situation ethically. And lastly, this assignment showed me that an example of how when you make a decision based off a personal belief, how that can potentially alter the outcome of a decision. And lastly, reflection. After completing this assignment in the class, I have learned techniques of how to handle ethical dilemmas. And when faced with tough decisions, this class has taught me how I can weigh the evidence of what is truly happening before making a logical and ethical decision. And again, with my reflection, I think actually having a situation like this come up while I was a new teacher, and I was able to see how my principal handled something very similar. So, thank you.